All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and tuning in. We're happy to have you here. Just a few announcements before we begin tonight. We have our holiday open house coming up on December 12th. So we hope to have you folks come out and join us for a festive day with demonstrators and reenactors, and the admission is free for that event. So bring your families and join us for some Christmas cheer. Our next lecture will be on January 20th, after the new year, and it will be presented by our very own John Thompson, our manager of historic programs. He will be presenting Reverse Colors, Music and Musicians of the American Army, a History. So you'll definitely want to tune in for that. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having Andrew Kircher with us. He has a BA in History and Philosophy from Albion College in Michigan and an MS in Historic Preservation from Eastern Michigan University. He is from Port Huron, Michigan originally, and spent a decade working at museums around the state of Michigan, including the Mackinac State Historic Parks, as an interpreter and as an assistant chief curator of the Dearborn Historical Museum before returning to work as the community engagement manager and curator of history at the Port Huron Museum System. When not at work, he collects antique firearms and has been working on restoring a 1958 Packard. He shares a lovely 1888 home on Main Street in Port Huron with his wife and his two cats, Gilbert and Sullivan. I love that. This lecture series, the Bentley Lecture Series, was created in memory of Christopher Perky, who served at Fort Meigs during the War of 1812, and is funded with the general support of the Anderton Bentley Fund. So please welcome Andrew.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for kind words and introduction. So when Kelly asked me, feels like a year ago, to do this lecture, I told him, Charles Gratiot was an interesting historical figure. So I work at the Port Huron Museum, where we have several sites within our museum system. One is the Fort Gratiot Light Station, which of course implies there was a Fort Gratiot. And Fort Gratiot was up in Port Huron, dates back to 1814. Obviously, I think anybody who's really into the War of 1812 would probably have heard this name batted around. So he's kind of a neat guy. And so I said, he's a neat guy. We'll see what we can do with it. So I've got kind of a biographical sketch of him and a little bit about Fort Gratiot, because unlike Fort Meigs, you can't really go visit Fort Gratiot. It's just not there anymore. The only building that remains is the post hospital. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on in our talk. But Charles Gratiot, I was trying to come up with a name for the whole talk. Kind of the best I came up with was A Road, a Fort, a Life, because lots of people have heard of Gratiot Avenue. It's one of the major roads that leads out of Detroit, connects up Detroit to Port Huron. There's Fort Gratiot. I think lots of local people from Michigan, maybe even North Ohio, know this name. They know how to say it. It's really funny when telemarketers call from around the world and they're like, "Are you living in Fort Gratiot?" I don't know how to say that. So there is a modern municipality called Fort Gratiot where my grandparents actually live, and it's just like a township. And again, you can always tell the spam calls when they have no idea how to say that. All right. There we go. All right, so this was a really interesting quote that I like that summed up Charles Gratiot. This is, I promise, the only time I'm going to read like big block text that I have up there. But the career of the petitioner in the Army of the United States during a long period of nearly 40 years, it's a matter of history that may justly excite the pride and admiration of every American citizen. Brave in battle, he presided for a long time with distinguished honor and ability at the head of one of the most difficult and arduous bureaus of the military department. Has left the country lasting monuments of his skill and science in the construction of various magnificent fortifications, both to exhibit her strength and to ensure her safety. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but at the end of Charles Gratiot's military career, he actually spent quite a bit of time in front of the United States Supreme Court. He was arguing for benefits that he felt were due to him, and almost certainly were due to him. He was kind of unjustly fired by President Martin Van Buren. But I really like skimming through these very, very dry 19th century Supreme Court arguments about like pay rates in the United States Army for brevet ranks and when they apply to and his bookkeeping. I found this quote that was again describing Charles Gratiot, and I was like, oh, there's a lot of nice things there, talking about that he worked in the Army for 40 years and did a good job, and everyone seemed to recognize that except for maybe Martin Van Buren. But our story of the Gratiot family actually goes all the way back to Lucerne, Switzerland. So this is where his father, Charles Gratiot Sr., was born. I know as a historian who deals a lot with 19th century historical figures, it's always fun when their parents' names are the same names as them, and it makes research extra fun. This is one of those cases because they don't use the junior or senior a whole lot, but you just got to kind of know which one you're dealing with. But Charles Gratiot Sr. is born in Switzerland. He gets involved with some of the French Huguenot type groups and winds up pretty quickly moving to New France as a young man. So he comes over the middle of kind of the 18th century, where he is a pretty successful fur trader. He heads out in the Pays de Nord, the back country. So he is not sticking around in like Montreal or the big cities in the East. He goes way out there, and really way out there, because the Gratiot family actually becomes pretty closely associated with St. Louis. So that is, the middle of the country. But actually, during the American Revolution, so we're talking the 1770s here, there's a sign here that's through the patriotism of Charles Gratiot in furnishing material aid, Colonel George Rogers Clark was able to keep his forces intact and recapture Fort Sackville. So basically, Charles Gratiot Sr. was pretty wealthy. He gave $8,000 to George Rogers Clark during his campaigns down in the Vincennes and attacking Fort Sackville. So George Rogers Clark is in this like Trans-Appalachian theater of the American Revolution, way out there, and he needs lots of money to buy supplies, and he gets it from Charles Gratiot. He's actually pretty thankful for that. Charles Gratiot at the end of the war says, like, could I have my money back? And has to eventually go all the way back across the Appalachians back to the East Coast and says, like, hey, I was not reimbursed. I'm a patriot and everything, but that was a loan, not a gift. I do need some of that money back. And they basically said, would you like several thousand acres of Kentucky instead? Because that's the best you're going to get. And that's basically what happens with that land, which he sells and continues to live in St. Louis. And here we see, I'm a big fan of these like late 19th century, sometimes early 20th century depictions of things from like the 18th century. Sometimes they're of questionable historical accuracy, but I think it's what a lot of people think of when they think of things like the capture of Fort Sackville, things like that. So good depiction there. But yeah, we can see St. Louis. He is out there on the fringe of what the Americans take when they gained their independence with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And in fact, we see a picture here. This is, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. And we can see, St. Louis right there on the Mississippi River in Missouri. That is right kind of in the center of where all of that is. And so when the Americans need an agent out there, when they negotiate this purchase from Napoleon, they're asking like, can somebody kind of be our boots on the ground for this transfer of power from the French and Spanish forces that were out in Louisiana? And well, they get Charles Gratiot, who was again a good, solid patriot during the American Revolution. And so, in fact, the year after they buy the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson famously sends out, Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery, and they go and stay with Charles Gratiot while they're getting the last parts together in St. Louis. He's kind of the last vestige of the United States that they see before they go out into like the great unknown on their trip. And Charles Gratiot Jr., our Charles Gratiot, was like hanging out with Lewis and Clark when he was a little kid in 1803, because they're hanging out at his house in St. Louis. So I think that's pretty cool. So shortly thereafter, Thomas Jefferson, president at the time, is trying to think of a way to thank Gratiot. And he says, well, your son is getting to be that age. He's, in his late teens. If you don't recognize this, this is the modern school at West Point. So West Point was a fortification during the American Revolution. This is the one that Benedict Arnold tries to betray and sell to the British. It controls shipping traffic. That's the Hudson River there. So it's about 50, 60 miles north of New York City, pretty strategically important. And today, when we say West Point, we don't think about the fort. We think about the United States Military Academy at West Point. And so Thomas Jefferson says like, hey, I started a new school basically a couple of years ago, like 1802. And this is, 1805. It says, does your 1804, I think it says just, we want to reward your son can come there. So he's one of these, basically a political appointee to West Point. And it actually works out really well that Charles Gratiot Jr. did exceptionally well there. A couple of his classmates that also get this kind of like favor that's owed to somebody. Will send your kid to school for free. Some of them don't do so well, or they graduate and they resign their commission after like a year or two in the Army. Charles Gratiot spends, a 40-year career. He really took the lessons here to heart. So he was in the class of 1806 at West Point, which at that time was getting to be an engineering school. Really, it's by the 1820s and 30s that it becomes like one of the premier engineering institutes in the entire Western Hemisphere, if not the whole world. In 1802, it's kind of crazy the number of things they teach you there. Everything from learning like French and Spanish and Latin to things like, oh yeah, that seems very applicable to the young republic when you want to go out and fight on the frontier. You should definitely know Latin. Important skill for any general to have. But when he's out there, he's seeing fortifications like this. This is another picture here. This is some of that classic like Vauban style fortification with the star forts and things like that. There's an entire military science to building these forts and what goes into them. We can see the football stadium for West Point in the background there. So this is kind of what he is surrounded by as he's getting this schooling that I, like mentioned, takes really to heart, because as soon as he graduates, he's placed right away into the Army Corps of Engineers, or what becomes the Army Corps of Engineers. He is one of these very few highly trained officers in a tiny army at the time. The New Republic has, soldiers' forces measured in thousands for the total force. So one of the very first assignments, a very young Lieutenant Charles Gratiot is sent out in 1807 is to Charleston, South Carolina. It's like major port of the South. Of course, later on, we think about Fort Sumter that's built there. He actually lays out kind of the groundwork for where Fort Sumter would eventually be built a couple of decades later. But he does some of the design work on like Fort Moultrie, improving these designs that were British era forts. And this is what he's really interested in, is building these forts, how they can protect cities and strategic interests like this. So that's one of the first things in his jobs. One of the things that I found really interesting, and I didn't realize this until I researched this, but and I know many of you in the audience are really like the War of 1812. So maybe you guys already knew this, but during the War of 1812, not a single fortification designed by a West Point graduate was ever captured by the British. I thought that was really cool. So it just shows the kind of skill level that went into these guys when they were getting that education. But of course, he's down in South Carolina for a few years. We're on to the War of 1812. This is, I give a lot of historical lectures. This is always my go-to kind of fantastic painting of Andrew Jackson up there, the Battle of New Orleans. What everybody thinks of, I think, when they think of the War of 1812, if you are not like a War of 1812 historian, this is what you picture. But he is actually assigned not down to New Orleans. That happens all the way in January of 1815. But he's almost immediately assigned to help out this guy right here, William Henry Harrison, who's operating in kind of the old Northwest, so Ohio, Michigan. The War of 1812 doesn't go very well for the United States at the very beginning of the war. They almost immediately lose control of all of Michigan. And so they're forced to send forces back over the winter of 1812-13 and into 1813, which is, of course, when Fort Meigs is built. I imagine anyone who might be watching the lecture be pretty familiar with Fort Meigs. I don't want to beat a dead horse or go over, ground we already have covered a lot of. But if you haven't been here, I highly recommend it. It's a really cool place to visit. It's a fantastic reconstruction of this kind of enormous fortification, so you can see why you would want multiple engineers working on this thing. The British try and take it more than once. It is under siege for a very long time. And again, speaks to the ability of some of these engineers like Charles Gratiot, who are designing this fortification really under a lot of pressure. They're not in a situation where they want to be. They don't have maybe the best ground in the whole wide world to build it on, and they're doing it quite quickly. So it really, again, speaks to his talent as a designer. But after Fort Meigs, after both sieges take place here, going into 1814, Fort Meigs accompanies the U.S. Army up to their failed attack at Fort Mackinac and Mackinac Island in the Straits of Mackinac. So he's there for the battle, which ends, it's kind of almost like an inconclusive day of fighting before Major Andrew Hunter Holmes goes off into the woods, and a detachment of officers are gunned down by some of the British native allies, and the entire American force decides, we're going to leave now. And they just politely leave off of the north side of the island. This is a great painting. If you want another good image of what some of those soldiers looked like, this is actually myself, my friend Kelly. We worked up at the Straits of Mackinac for a long time. There's a lot of great 1812 stories up there. We've gone back and garrisoned Fort Holmes many times, doing our best to keep the British at bay in the post 1812 world. They haven't come back yet, so I'd say we did our job pretty well. But after that failure up at Fort Mackinac, actually a little bit before that, they sent soldiers to these strategic locations throughout the Great Lakes. American command at that time is thinking, we've got these large water border to defend with British Canada. There are a number of very strategic choke points on the Great Lakes. We should fortify lots of them. In fact, there's a plan at one point to build something like 15 forts on the coast of Michigan to keep the British at bay. The first one they get well underway is at Fort Gratiot, which you can see all the way up at the very top of our map, right up there. So, I got Detroit down here, Lake St. Clair, the St. Clair River, and Fort Gratiot is there guarding the mouth of the St. Clair River into Lake Huron. This is basically the only one they get done before higher ups get word of all of this massive and very expensive plans to build forts. They said, knock it off, stop, don't do that. Well, okay, I guess if Fort Gratiot is already done, you can have that one, but don't build any of the others. So Fort Gratiot is constructed. And actually, this is kind of a recent find that we were very, very excited about at the Port Huron Museum. Anyone who is a big Fort Gratiot aficionado, this picture was recently scanned in the National Gallery of Canada. And literally none of us knew it existed. This is something that even some of the people that I've been working with putting out a book, a really academic look at Fort Gratiot and involving some of the findings from the extensive archaeological research there. Like literally the expert on Fort Gratiot, we had no idea that this existed. So this was recently scanned in the National Gallery of Canada. This was a painter who he worked in Sullivan, I think is his last name. He worked in he accompanied the British on campaign in Egypt in 1801. So there's lots, and his medium is exclusively watercolor, which has its ups and downs. They're very pretty, but not great for detail. So he does a very good job of capturing like the ambiance of how it felt to be in a sandstorm in Egypt. Or this example that he painted in 1821. So this is the earliest depiction of Fort Gratiot that exists. He's looking here. This is in the St. Clair River, looking north to Lake Huron up there. You can see the river makes kind of a sharp turn there, and this little tiny row of white things right here. That is Fort Gratiot. You can see like a couple, maybe a bateau or a canoe pulled up on the side. There's just a tiny little bit of a rise in the hill that's more or less artificial right there at the bank of the river. When we were first looking at this on our early scan, before we even got a high resolution scan, we were all trying to figure out what on earth mountain this was before we realized it's just kind of like the ripped sail of the little sloop here. Like, man, watercolor is not a great way to document like good details, because like, yes, that's a very nice job on the clouds, but could I see the buildings, please? Is what we all were saying as historians. But we're very lucky that this exists and we still have it. And this is much, much, much larger than even the full size. This is like on a 3x5 card that he paints this little drawing on, but it is the earliest known depiction of Fort Gratiot. And this gives you kind of an idea. This is actually from the archaeological research on Fort Gratiot, an idea of what we see here. So when he builds this, they of course named this one after him. There's always a good advice if you ever find yourself in the 19th century military and you are building a fort, it always helps to name it after like your superior officer. It's just a good piece of life advice. So Charles Gratiot, who supervises the construction of the fort, they wind up naming it after him. And they include a large number of barracks, a couple of officers' barracks, and storehouses. And it is a simple palisaded fort, not too dissimilar from Fort Meigs, except that since they have basically a blank canvas to work with, they're right there on the water. They include some large gun embrasures that face out towards the river. The river is only about 800 feet across. You place a couple of 18-pound cannons there. You get to decide who goes up and down that river. That was the whole point of the fort. Now, the War of 1812 ends. Charles Gratiot, along with others, quite a few, anyone famous you can think of from the War of 1812, and Charles Gratiot, who I think maybe have not heard of, they get an award. They get the Thanks of Congress. This is before there are a lot of like military medals. There's no Medal of Honor or like Bronze Star with oak leaf clusters. They get the Thanks of Congress. So I always think that's just a little funny these days to think about like that being an official military award. But Congress does recognize all of the work that they had put in. So Gratiot is actually promoted again by this point. He's basically a colonel. He is serving down again with the engineers. They realize what he is good at. They start sending him out to forts, and he lays out the fort right here. This is actually the Fortress Monroe, which guards the Hampton Roads at Virginia. And this is a fort that probably many more people associate with the Civil War. It plays a huge role in the Civil War as it controls entrance to like the James River, the Chesapeake Bay. It is a fort that, while in the middle of Virginia, stays firmly in Union hands because this was unassaultable. You would have taken every soldier in the Confederate Army of every theater, and they couldn't have taken that fort. It was, it did its job. They didn't even try. And honestly, if you rate forts, the best fort that you build is the one that's never attacked, because that tells you it was built so well that the enemy felt its defenses could not be reasonably overcome. So if you build a fort well enough, there's no battles there. There's never an attack. And so, yeah, he builds the Fortress Monroe, which you can see here. And there's Chesapeake Bay, the James River. And this is constantly, again, if you're a student of the Civil War, where Union forces either are retreating to or gathering up for another campaign on Richmond. They said, let's gather up at Fortress Monroe, stick another couple thousand soldiers there, and maybe this time McClellan will take, Richmond. So he's working on that fort for about 7 years. In the 1820s, by about 1821 or so, he's actually reassigned to head back to West Point. I showed you that picture of West Point earlier, what it looks like as a school today. Here's what it looked like in the late 1820s. It's a little more of an idyllic setting with the Hudson River and a couple of buildings and those older fortifications like we saw earlier. There's another good, this is West Point, New York. This is what things looked like in the 1820s. I personally love the enormous conga line of soldiers stretching off into the distance there in this little watercolor block print there. So he is an instructor there for a little bit. Makes sense. You get good, and then you teach on the next generation. But by 1828, until the end of his career, Charles Gratiot was recalled to Washington, D.C., where he takes over the entire engineering department for the United States Army. So he is in charge of assigning the lesser engineers to go out to these forts. This is an era of kind of the third system of U.S. fortifications. They're building forts all over the country at that time. And Charles Gratiot is the one assigning engineers to go out and build them and make sure that their progress is going well. And this is a good picture of what Washington, D.C. looked like in the 1830s. So, the dome didn't quite look like it did today. Congress doesn't have these great big halls on either side. So this is where he lived. A sizable portion of his life was in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. But kind of the downfall for Charles Gratiot is accounting. Very sad looking 1940s accountant. Should give you an idea. Now, let's be clear. Charles Gratiot maintained that he did everything properly and above board. And actually, it's kind of hard to tell one way or the other because there's a little bit of this historical he said, she said. But for most people fall on the side that he was doing everything properly. The Army was always struggling with funding, getting appropriations from Congress. Today, when we fund the United States Army in like 2021, they could say, I want $5 billion to build an aircraft carrier. And Congress will basically say, sure, go ahead. And there's very little discussion about it. No one is ever really questioning what the Army wants to spend money on. Go ahead. It is the largest chunk of spending discretionary spending that we have today. This is not the case in the 1830s. They would be coming to Congress saying like, hi, could I have some boots, please, that don't have holes in them? And they're like, I don't know, those probably still have some life left. You could go a few more miles in them. So they are very, very much penny pinchers. They're very tight with their money. They want to make sure that it's getting good use. So with Charles Gratiot, in his position, he's playing a lot of politics as well. One of the things, kind of reading between the lines, one of the things that I suspect is going on is that by 1838, when he is fired, they are already looking towards the election of 1840. There's the Panic of 1837. The economy is like extra in shambles in 1838. And we know that Charles Gratiot had served with William Henry Harrison. They had maintained kind of correspondence. Seems like there might be actually some political disagreements between this kind of apolitical role that Gratiot is holding as head of the engineers and Martin Van Buren when there are these accusations of financial impropriety. They said, we gave you like $25,000 and you haven't accounted for how all of it was spent properly. And they go back and forth and back and forth. And eventually Martin Van Buren says, I am the commander in chief, you are fired. And that's basically the end of that, because there are two Supreme Court cases. Charles Gratiot makes his case that not only was he in the right, he wants to set the record straight, but he's also gets denied quite a few of his benefits for having served. He's not getting the money. He said that, he was promised a certain amount of money. He was serving as like a brevet brigadier general, which is where they are promoting people. It's not your real rank, but it, for most intents and purposes, is your rank, and you get that extra money. He's arguing that, that is the case and he's not been paid properly. And he, again, wants to clear his name. He makes it in front of the Supreme Court twice with this, which, as much as anything else might tell you just how small the United States is in the 1830s, that like a weird argument that today could be settled by HR has to go to the United States Supreme Court. But this is from Martin Van Buren. Having failed to pay into the Treasury the balance of monies placed in his hands in 1835 for public purposes, after suspending therefrom the amount which he claims to be due to him on settlement of accounts, according to the President's order communicated to him by the Secretary of War on the 20th of November, 1838, having neglected to render his accounts in obedience to the law of January 31st, 1823. This is basically his this is why you're fired. What it again came down to was he's given the money. He has to take out his own payout of the money. The government claims he took out more than he should have. He said, no, this was the proper amount that I was allotted. And I got the receipts to back it up. Supreme Court just isn't friendly to him, nor is Martin Van Buren. I had to include my favorite piece of political ephemera of Martin Van Buren here, choking on his ugly mug of log cabin hard cider. Again, I think they're playing politics a little bit because of this connection to Harrison, who would be running against Martin Van Buren and beating him. But he goes to the Supreme Court. James Moore Wayne in this really fiery looking like ambrotype here. I just love this era of photography and this hairstyle. It's like before pictures, no one realized like bad hair days were a thing, or that you can comb your hair before they take your picture. But it's just like, nah, just take it. So James Wayne writes basically very long opinion for the majority saying, yeah, you're probably right. These receipts probably add up, but guess what? He's the president and he can fire you if he wants. I'm sorry, your petition is dismissed. And long and short, that's what happens to it. This is the Roger Taney court. In fact, some of the same arguments are going on like right around the same time as the Dred Scott decision is being made, which I also kind of find funny that like those could be on the docket at the same time, where it's one of the most important Supreme Court decisions and like, abysmal ones, that the Dred Scott decision basically says that Black people are not humans. They're not people. They're not deserving of any recognition of justice under the law. And next up, let's hear some receipt disputes from Charles Gratiot. Those are on the same day at the Supreme Court. So he retires from military life, obviously not by choice. He had spent many, many years, but he heads back to become a land clerk in St. Louis. And this is actually a photo from late in life of Mr. Gratiot. He heads back to St. Louis, which was pretty booming by the 1850s. It is a Mississippi River town. There's always land going back and forth, and he was an expert at paperwork. So it makes a lot of sense that that is the kind of work that he would put on. He lives quite a long life. He dies in 1855, so he is in his late 60s, I think, if I did the math right. When he does die, not uncommon today, certainly not uncommon in the 1850s. And he is buried with his family and his wife in St. Louis. So you can go see that today. So that's a little bit about Charles Gratiot, the man. Now I want to talk a little bit about Fort Gratiot, the fort that's named in his honor, because I think that's only appropriate. Fort Gratiot was actually not the first fort that was built on that site. If we go back all the way to the 1680s, we've got Sir Grayson Duluth, who Duluth is named for. He's in command of a small detachment he's sent out by LaSalle. They're told to build a fort at a strategic location. They find the mouth of the St. Clair River. This is actually a great piece from Port Huron. Oh, I don't know if our internet has stayed stable or not. Hopefully we're good. Probably that seems gone away. This is a great picture that appeared in our local newspaper. They did this long series. It was like an animated history of the area, but shows, the Griffin sailed by. I really just like the 1940s drawings of the 1680s. But, the Griffin is sailing by what would become the site of Fort St. Joseph, is what the French call it. That's another one of these confusing forts to research, because the French love naming forts Fort St. Joseph. There are like half a dozen of them just around the Great Lakes. So you got to know like the exact year of the Fort St. Joseph you're talking about. They do eventually abandon Fort St. Joseph, and they head up here to Fort Dubois in the Straits of Mackinac in 1688. But there's some kind of neat things that go on there. My favorite thing is the fact that they capture actually a couple of Dutch traders coming from like New Amsterdam up this way. It's one of those things I never think about in Michigan, like Dutch traders coming out here, but it was going on all the way up in the thumb of Michigan in the 1680s. And they interred him for the summer, and I have to imagine it was like kind of under arrest, but also kind of just hanging out. They're not letting him trade. They're also not letting him go, but he's not like in jail. That would have been one of those historical figures. He's kind of nameless. I don't have a name for him. They don't write that down. But one of those people in history that I would like to meet sometime. Dutch trader imprisoned at Fort St. Joseph in 1686. So here we have, I've got a couple of really high resolution scans from the War Department looking at Fort Gratiot, because there were a number of different plans for the fort. This was my personal favorite ones, which is actually drawn by Mr. Meigs right here. This is a design from 1846. They had plans to make Fort Gratiot into this massively fortified star fortification, just like you'd see on the East Coast or back in Europe. However, your US history, in 1846 is also the outbreak of the Mexican War. And as a result, instead of massively upgrading the fortifications at Fort Gratiot, it's completely abandoned. They have to send all of the soldiers from Fort Gratiot down to go fight in Mexico, which they do. Actually, the only soldiers from Michigan that fought in the Mexican War were the garrison at Fort Mackinac at that time. There are some drawings later. So this is an earlier drawing. This one is done in the 1820s. This is very, very simple drawing, which I like, but shows, so north would be this way. But we can see we've got shallow water here. This would be Sarnia. You can even see it says Port Sarnia down here. This is the Black River. And this is Indian reservation. So this was part of the Treaty of Detroit in 1807. There's a very small Indian reservation here, as well as another part of St. Clair County. This is eventually goes away in 1836 with Indian removal policies. But we also see the Fort Gratiot Turnpike. So this road would take you all the way down to Detroit. And there's Fort Gratiot Fort, tiny little fort right here at the outlet to the county. And this says Rapids, if you can't read it. So this is the site. If you've been to Port Huron, one thing about Port Huron, it's probably the Blue Water Bridge is there. Blue Water Bridge is right there at the north. So right above what is called the Rapids. Now, Fort Gratiot very quickly becomes obsolete. Not necessarily militarily, not the technology. I mean, if you put a couple cannons there today, you could probably tell boats who could go and who could come. But the big thing is the Treaty of Rushmore. So this treaty between the United States and Canada limited the number of warships on the Great Lakes. They both said, this is crazy. Let's not get into an arms race. What if we each have like 1 or 2 warships on the Great Lakes? We limit them to 100 tons and they can each only have one 18-pound cannon on board. Both sides agree. All of a sudden, there aren't warships going back and forth. Your fort to control shipping traffic, it's kind of pointless, isn't it? You know, why build a fort when you don't have ships to shoot at? So the fort in 1821 is abandoned. It's turned into a school. People kind of move into the building, so it's abandoned by the U.S. Army, not completely abandoned. But by 1828, tensions are on the rise again. Black Hawk's War. So there were a series of native conflicts going on out in Wisconsin and Illinois in the late 1820s, the 1830s. 1832, Black Hawk's War is the big one that is going on, and they are calling basically all hands. Black Hawk, it's a tale as old as time. He'd been promised a massive reservation that he could live on with his band forever until white colonists begin arriving and planting farms. Black Hawk doesn't like this and begins burning down farms and killing white people on his reservation. So the United States Army is sent in to suppress the revolt. So they send in tons of soldiers. The garrison at Fort Gratiot are told, hey, you need to get out into Wisconsin as quickly as possible. Now, we do have, the War Department basically tells the garrison there, we have good news and we have bad news. Good news is we secured partial transportation. The bad news is it's at Fort Dearborn in Chicago. So you need to walk from Port Huron to Chicago before you can get on your boat to go the rest of the way on the journey. So those guys walk out that way. It is a very, very long trip. So we'll talk a little bit more about one other incident that comes up with Black Hawk's War. But the fort is continually occupied in the 1850s. I always love, this is another highlight of a map. This is a drawing of the military reservation at Fort Gratiot, which again shows, the Black River, St. Clair River. Those are the fort buildings and the outbuildings. The cool thing is who drew this one. You are a student of military history, you might recognize Captain George Meade, who was the Union commander at Gettysburg. It's pretty cool. So he's signed there to draw maps of the Fort Gratiot and surrounding area. Now, this is another guy who was stationed at Fort Gratiot. Now, this requires a tiny bit of audience participation, which I know a lot of folks will be watching this on YouTube, so you could throw it up in the comments when you watch it. But for those here, I know some of you are very militarily inclined. Do we recognize who this is? Absolutely. Any guesses? What if I said he looked like this later in life? We all recognize him, right? It's Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee was actually stationed at Fort Gratiot as well. Actually, Robert E. Lee took a number of engineering jobs from Charles Gratiot, who was back in Washington, D.C. This is the time Robert E. Lee has graduated from West Point. He's an engineer himself. He's being dispatched all over, including like St. Louis, some other places where he's dealing with flood projects, like building levees, the kinds of things the Corps of Engineers does as well. He was stationed in Port Huron in like the 1830s. One of my favorite things that happens there is he actually develops a pretty poor reputation in town in Port Huron in the 1830s, well before the Civil War. He had this penchant of knowing that he was going to be transferred from like fort to fort all over the country. And Robert E. Lee, I think when many of us think of him, it's like the Honorable Southern Gentleman Plantation owner. Very wealthy, but Robert E. Lee actually doesn't have any money. His wife, Mary Custis, has all the money. So he actually runs up these huge debts in town and then just leaves because it's, 1832. How are you going to get him to pay that debt if he goes to Arkansas and you're in Michigan? It's kind of hard to do. Well, basically, one of the storekeepers in Port Huron gets wise to this. And as he's about to be shipped out, like the next day, shows up at the town constable and says, like, excuse me, Mr. Lee, you've forgotten something. And they go to the captain of the post, who has to remind, like, Lieutenant Lee, you do need to pay your debts. You can't leave. And he says, oh, I must have forgotten. Like, sheepishly gets him the money. But apparently he had, like I said, quite the negative and dishonorable reputation in Port Huron, like, decades before the Civil War, and he turned traitor. So in the 1830s, another kind of incident that goes on at Fort Gratiot. I just love these military uniforms. They're some of my favorites, the bell crown Shako, very elaborate and fancy looking. Cholera. So during Black Hawk's War, as I mentioned before, a lot of the soldiers are sent out from Fort Gratiot to go out to Wisconsin to fight, and they send reinforcements. They said, we'll send reinforcements as quick as we can. The reinforcements they send come from Virginia. They put these men on a boat, they send them up to New York City. New York City, they are sent up the Erie Canal, and they get onto the Great Lakes at Buffalo. They get onto a steamship called the Henry Clay Jr., and they are sent from Buffalo. They're going to go all the way to Chicago, but they basically get to Detroit. By the time they get to Detroit, there's an outbreak of cholera on the ship. So cholera is a bacterial infection that is not a pleasant thing. You get the worst diarrhea you will ever have in your life. In fact, many, many people die from it. You will become incredibly dehydrated. And later on in history, they figure out by the 1850s it's caused by bad drinking water. In the 1830s, they don't know that. They think it might be bad air. They think there's lots of theories, but no one keys in on the fact that it is contaminated drinking water. And cholera can spread very quickly. In an era before modern sanitation sewers, when lots of people get diarrhea, that gets into the water, and then more people get sick. And it's a self-feeding loop there. Pretty nasty, nasty stuff. You can see this poster from New York in the 1830s, like, abstain from cold water. Like, well, I mean, it's not cold water. It could be any temperature water. There are all sorts of ideas about this, but cholera. I liked this little cartoon as well, a warning to landlords. Cholera saying, you'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself. It was known to run rampant through poor areas in towns. So cholera, when the Henry Clay Jr. pulls into Detroit, Detroit at the time has about 6,000 residents. So this is not a small town. This is sizable compared to the East Coast. It's not a frontier. And the city fathers of Detroit say, you absolutely cannot unload a boat full of cholera-sick soldiers into our city of 6,000 people. Lots of people will die. What you can do, however, is go up to Fort Gratiot. There's very few people up there. All the soldiers have already marched away to go to Chicago, but there's a couple still left behind to watch the buildings. There's a post hospital, supplies, and a few dozen scattered residents. But go up there. So the soldiers start to head up that way. By the time the boat is pulling into Fort Gratiot in the St. Clair River, there are men jumping overboard when they pull into dock, and officers are shooting at them and like trying to maintain any sense of order because dozens of men have already died on the boat. Dozens more would die of cholera on land. Some of them ran into the woods, never seen again. Some of them attempted to make their way down the Plank Road, down Gratiot Avenue, back to Detroit, but unfortunately they died along the way. They had already developed cholera, but hadn't shown any symptoms. They died 25 miles down the road, and then next thing you know, you got bears and wolves coming out of the woods to eat them. It's a gruesome summer in 1832. And in fact, there are many of the soldiers buried here at this lot in Fort Huron. They're actually moved here in the 1870s, which is why it looks like a Civil War lot. Most of them were given new headstones. They put up this anti-Civil War looking monument, but most of those men actually died of the cholera epidemic in the 1830s. Another kind of incident that takes place at Fort Gratiot takes place, like I said, I love these 19th century woodcuts. This is actually a picture of like the Battle of Windsor during the Patriot War. This is one of like most obscure conflicts in history because it's a Canadian uprising. Nobody ever knows of this one in the United States. Very few Canadians seem to even know about it. To make a long story short, there were some Canadians who were objecting to the crown and objecting to the way Canada was being run as a colony. And there's a massive revolt. And there were lots of Americans who were eager to, maybe make Canada a new state. And they were running guns and gunpowder and weapons into Canada. And that's, it's put down very quickly. Is kind of the end story of it. But Fort Gratiot, the arms there were nearly seized. A large number of these groups called Hunters Lodges showed up in 1837. They broke their way into Fort Gratiot. They're taking like stands of arms. They're taking gunpowder, all sorts of things like that. When the guard at Detroit, the Brady Guard, is sent up because they wind up in this three-way showdown because there are the residents of Port Huron. They're kind of watching all of this. You've got the hunters who are wanting to supply these arms to the Canadians. The Canadian soldiers in Sarnia, who can basically see all of this a few hundred feet away across the river, are actually threatening to come over and burn the fort down and like burn down the city of Port Huron if those arms go into what they're seeing as rebel terrorist hands. The citizens of Port Huron don't want that to happen. Then you have soldiers who are immediately dispatched from Detroit show up and say, no, put those back. Those belong to the United States Army. We don't care as much about, these rebels, whatever, you just can't steal. And you have a like three-way showdown until cooler heads fortunately prevailed. Everybody put the guns down. The Canadians didn't have to invade, and the guns are returned to the armory at Fort Gratiot. It's kind of like the closest we come to like a battle at Fort Gratiot. Fort Gratiot was also the site and lends its name to a lighthouse. There was a lighthouse that was built in 1825 at Fort Gratiot, like in one of the bastions, basically, the very corner of the light. It was actually very poorly sighted, though, because sailors said they couldn't see it until they had already entered the St. Clair River, which really does you no good for a lighthouse. So fortunately, it blew down in a gale in 1828. I say fortunately because, again, it was poorly sighted and no one was killed. And the Congress appropriated $5,000 to build a new light, which you can see here. So that's 1829. It's the oldest lighthouse in the state of Michigan, which has more lighthouses than any other state. It's pretty awesome. And massive work has been done to the lighthouse over the years. Some of the most recent efforts actually included like resurfacing all of the brick and ongoing archaeological investigations, which is pretty cool. Here you can kind of see an overview of all of this. You can see the bridge. This is Lake Huron. Fort Gratiot's just on the other side of that bridge. So you can see a couple 100 yards difference between where the original Fort Gratiot light was and the new Fort Gratiot light, which, while not at Fort Gratiot anymore, still kept the same name. This is also very confusing today to visitors to Port Huron because Fort Gratiot, as I mentioned, is the name of a township, but the Fort Gratiot light is in Port Huron and not Fort Gratiot Township. And Fort Gratiot is nowhere to be seen. So it can be very confusing unless you get this whole slideshow and story. So yeah, the inside of these buildings, we've done massive work on as well. Although we are restoring many of the buildings you see here, like the duplexes built in the 1870s, and we're restoring them. How do they appear in the 1930s? Because the most recent buildings on the grounds were built in the 1930s. That's the last time there was a civilian lighthouse keeper. And of course, the wonderful Blue Water Bridge, which opened in 1938. There's a lot of cool stories of the 1930s to tell there. So, you know, the inside is something to see. Now, here's a drawing of Fort Gratiot from the engineering department. We could see this is kind of what it looked like in the 1850s. And you notice that it's kind of like canted at an angle up this way. And eventually this entire bastion would be cut off by an important piece of infrastructure. So again, if we think about Port Huron and infrastructure, the most famous piece of infrastructure, of course, is the Blue Water Bridge. But that's not what did it. It's actually a little closer to this. Guesses? It is a tunnel. Yeah, so this is the St. Clair River Tunnel. So it's not the tunnel specifically, but the railway. Port Huron became a pretty important rail hub. There was the very first underwater international tunnel that connected Port Huron and Sarnia. It was dug in the 1880s, but even before then, as early as 1857, the rail line that was connecting Port Huron and Detroit, the larger Midwest, they had rail ferries that could then send trains across to Sarnia. It became a huge, important kind of transportation bottleneck, but we're only 3 hours away from Niagara Falls, the East Coast. If you're shipping something from Chicago to say Boston or New York, sometimes it's faster to come up through Port Huron, cut across Canada, take a straight line. It was a pretty attractive place to come and build lots and lots of trains. So it's the 1860s that you see the train lines being built in Port Huron. In fact, here is the 1857 Fort Gratiot Depot, because this was just a couple, this is like 100 yards away from Fort Gratiot. And this set of train tracks, which is still in use to this day, there's a paper factory down at this end of the train tracks that they go pick up paper from once or twice a month. This set of train tracks actually basically cut off part of the bastion of the fort. The U.S. Army said by the 1850s, like, yeah, we don't really care. We'll give you like right of way. Although there were numerous other times later on in history, like the 1870s, one of the things that eventually led to the downfall of Fort Gratiot was an enormous feud between the railway and the United States Army. And it wasn't the Army so much as the United States. The railway kept saying, hey, you know, they were having trouble with Congress. And they took it out on the soldiers as represented as the government by parking large numbers of freight cars with like rotten beef in them and just leaving that outside of the fort. So when there was actually an inspection of the fort, the health inspector for the Army came by and was like, oh, this is awful. All of these men will be diseased. There's a horrible miasma in the air, and it's just rotting beef parked nearby. There are other times where soldiers said they would hang out all their laundry because they don't have dryers. And that's when the train company, Grand Trunk, instructed train operators to like dump all of the soot from their train as they were going by, to ruin the laundry. Again, that's one way to take it out on the United States government, by focusing on the lowest paid members of the government, these poor soldiers. But there's one other famous resident to this depot. Again, I'll ask the audience. I know one of you knows. Any guesses who this is? It's something, if you're from Port Huron, you definitely have seen this picture, you know who it is. All right, I'll give you another hint. Any better? He's there. Yeah, with something he's well known for. All right, I'll give you one more. And if you, it is Thomas Edison. You are right. Thomas Edison grew up in Port Huron, just about 100 yards away from Fort Gratiot. So his house was on the military reserve. That could be its own whole presentation, because he gets into an argument. His father gets into an argument with the Army, who eventually takes their house away. It then burns down under slightly mysterious circumstances a few weeks later. But Thomas Edison grew up right there on the military reserve. We know that actually as a young child, he liked to play pranks on the soldiers. And he wrote about this in some of his journals. One of the things he'd like to do is he'd sneak out with a couple of his friends. And even though, Fort Gratiot was a very peaceful post, it's still an active armed forces base. So there is a sentry duty place 24/7, 365. There are always soldiers on duty at sentry posts outside the fort perimeter, watching to make sure other soldiers don't leave, as much as anybody trying to sneak into the fort. And then they said that as a young boy, they would sneak out and call for like the captain of the guard. And basically like prank call, because you could just shout out, like captain of the guard to post number 3, and then like run and hide. And the captain of the guard would walk out and go to post number 3, and the guy would be like, I didn't call you. Eventually one day they discover it's Edison. They chase him down to his house. And Edison hid in his basement under a barrel of rotten potatoes. And his father was like, I don't know where he is, because these soldiers were threatening to just beat him, because it's like 1859. That's something you could do to children then. But yeah, Thomas Edison spent his childhood there. In fact, it was made into a major motion picture a little bit later on in 1940 called Young Tom Edison, which is all about his time in Port Huron, right next to Fort Gratiot. His very first job was riding the train from that train station past the fort down to Detroit. He would sell apples and candy and newspapers, you name it. So they made this movie in 1940 with box office star Mickey Rooney. He was the #1 draw at the box office in 1940. And in fact, that movie premiered in Port Huron, which is, this seems like a weird thing to like brag about today. But this was enormous in 1940 when that premiered. Did someone have a question, or
someone's really excited
hearing the spooky ghosts?
Premiere.
So the Desmond Theater, as just like an aside, this theater opened 100 years ago last week. 100 years old. But Mickey Rooney came to town. Thomas Edison's wife came here. Thomas Edison was dead by this time, but Lina Edison was there. Edsel Ford was there. A couple of the studio heads from Metro Goldwyn Mayer was there. Samuel B. Mayer came there to town for this premiere. It was huge to have a movie premiere, because this is an era before movie stars go on like Jimmy Fallon and like a talk show. Like the only time you saw a movie star was in a movie and they're 30 feet tall. So for like a real life movie star to come to your town telling a story that took place in your town was amazing. They actually recreated, they rode in a train. They had like beard growing contests in Port Huron. Everyone dressed up like the 1860s and had like Fort Gratiot days and things like that. And this was young Tom Edison, Mickey Rooney in character on this train selling candy and nuts and things like that. Huge deal. So closing in towards the end of the life of Fort Gratiot, there's one last kind of major incident I wanted to talk about. And that's the Fenian raids, which were, sounds like a crazy idea today, but it was the idea that in the immediate era after the Civil War, there were hundreds of thousands of expat Irishmen who are living in the United States, who have ample military training and access to cheap and surplus firearms at the end of the Civil War. The idea, invade Canada and hold it hostage for Ireland. Seems crazy, but kind of makes sense a little. And so this was the Fenian Brotherhood. That was their idea. And in fact, there were some battles in Canada in 1866. This one took place out west, but all along the Canadian border in 1866, earlier a little bit in the 1830s, but really right after the Civil War, there was this very upcoming movement that people were starting to join. Now, this is a very fanciful drawing. The battle was not this big, but I love that it also looks like a Christmas battle. These guys were probably not as well uniformed as you see here, but that also happens at Fort Gratiot. Basically, in 1866, a large number of local Irish residents had gathered. They were going to take the guns and stores from Fort Gratiot, cross into Sarnia, and help their Fenian brothers who were doing it in Buffalo. They're going to do it in Detroit, all over, kind of at the same time. Wasn't particularly well coordinated. Basically, it's an open secret. And so they actually call out like the Lambton Guard in Sarnia. There are about 2,000 soldiers waiting in Sarnia with their redcoats and like rifles waiting, saying like, do you want to try this? Do you want to try like a Normandy landing here across the river? And the Irish had made their way into Fort Gratiot. They had grabbed a cannon. They dragged it down to the foot of Griswold Street. And they're like, all right, we're coming. Any minute now, we're going to load this up in the boat. And sure, real shortly now. And everyone's kind of like looking around and they could see the redcoats across the river. And basically the police show up and are like, guys, just go home. Like, just wheel the cannon back. You can all leave. No one has to die today because that's what's going to happen. And everyone kind of gets cold feet. It peters out. But again, as close as we get to a battle at Fort Gratiot is steal all the weapons and plan to invade Canada and then just politely put them back when you realize it's a bad idea. So I do have a few pictures. There are very, very few images. As I mentioned before, right at the beginning, we saw that watercolor. There are a couple of photographs from Fort Gratiot. Almost all of them were taken the same day, right about 1866, right at that same time, right after the Civil War, 66 or 67. They're all very, very high resolution because they're these beautiful glass plates. You can see the soldiers here, resplendent in their hardy hats, gloves. They all have like Allen conversion Springfield, so cartridge firearms. But we can see what a pleasant post this looks like. This isn't a harsh, this is kind of the opposite of Fort Meigs when it comes to like living accommodations. This isn't like out of necessity of battle and we're going to live in a mud hut. This is like, oh, we have very nice buildings that are painted and pleasant, and there's leafy green trees inside and pleasant walkways back and forth. You can see again all the soldiers enjoying like officers' porches and things like that. There was, light posts inside, and this is I love this as a zoom in. You can see actually some of like officers' wives. They're hanging out on the porch here. Other, civilians visiting. This was in a city, so it's not like in the middle of nowhere either. So that's a nice pleasant thing. We can't see. I mean, there were cannons, there were storage, things like that. But you also think like this family just having a picnic there. Again, it's a great depository of these images. So we do come to this picture. This is actually the Fort Gratiot Post Hospital. This is one of the only period pictures of the building. You can see back here is actually an addition. This was a morgue that they added on a little bit later on, a little morbid, but important to have. And this is what that hospital looked like about 120 years after it was moved. So Fort Gratiot closes in 1879. There's a round of Army budget cuts. They realize it's obsolete and not needed. They close it. Many of the buildings are carted off. The Fort Gratiot Post Hospital was actually cut in half and turned into two separate homes that were then occupied in Port Huron for decades and decades and decades. Around the year 2000, an archaeologist and then some local historians kind of looked into it, and they discovered, hey, wait a second, that tiny house that you're about to tear down, we think it might be half of the hospital. And you can see it doesn't look anything like the hospital. They've added on crazy looking modern shingles. There's like siding, this not something that streams to me. That looks like the post hospital from 1828. But lo and behold, they get inside, it sure was. And this is what it looks like today. So we've done nothing short of a miracle of historic preservation and putting this back together. It's on the grounds of the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse. So this has been moved once again several hundred yards north of where it was originally built. But this is as close as you can get to visiting Fort Gratiot, the namesake of Charles Gratiot. So there's a great connection here that you can come see. And you can see the inside, we're still dealing with, beams and plywood, and it's going to be a long road to hoe to completely restore the inside of this hospital, tell the military and medical history of St. Clair County, the story of these people, the story of people like Charles Gratiot. Those are the kinds of things we will be telling in the Fort Gratiot Post Hospital. So it's a work in progress. So hopefully if you ever make your way up to the Thama, Michigan, the Knuckle, you visit the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse, you can also visit the hospital. And if it is something you're really interested in, it is typically seasonal, so it's open from April to like December. But if you're in town in February and you want to see this, my name and contact information is at the end. I work for the museum. Look me up. I got keys to the place. I'll take you in. Anybody who's that interested, I'll show you. We'll spend an afternoon looking at it. It is a cool place. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention, like, there are a couple other sites in the Port Huron Museum system. If you are up that way, just south of the Fort Gratiot Post Hospital, Fort Gratiot Lighthouse is the Thomas Edison Depot Museum. And just south of that is the Huron Lightship, which was the very last lightship to be active on the Great Lakes until 1970, believe it or not. That was heading out and marking the entrance to the Corsica Shoals, keeping sailors safe as a floating lighthouse. It's now permanently dried out here and toured as a museum ship. Now, of course, we have our wonderful Carnegie Center, which is a traditional museum located in a Carnegie library from 1904. That's where my office is. So that kind of brings me to the end of our presentation. So that's, again, my name is Andrew Kircher from Port Huron Museums. I hope you enjoyed things. I know a lot of folks are going to be catching this maybe on the repeat or on YouTube. You can feel free to send me an email, give me a phone call. I'd love to talk more about Charles Gratiot or Fort Gratiot or any of those things in connection with that. I think it is really cool history. I do really want to thank the folks here at Fort Meigs for having me out to talk about this. I know you guys sure have a challenge in finding speakers related to Fort Meigs. It's a cool site, but obviously very, very niche. And we're the same way with Fort Gratiot. So I think it's really cool that like 1812 and 1812 tangential sites get to work together like this to tell what is, sadly, maybe an obscure part of our history, but one that doesn't maybe deserve to be, because it's some pretty cool, important stuff that still impacts us to this day. So with that, again, thank you all very much.